Good evening. The confession, part 3. This is gewaldige stuff. You know, you have to analyze literally every single nuance of the Gemara to be able to appreciate the profundity. It's actually wild. Okay, so we're on Daf Pei Zayin. We're still on the same page. And just going to cover a small amount of text today, but in a very, very foundational way. The Gemara, in the previous episode, recorded a number of different methodologies by virtue of which a person can properly fulfill the mitzvah of confession. We have already established what kind of mitzvah this is, why it's necessary, why it's important, especially on Yom Kippur. We also talked about the timing. And then we said, okay, how do you do this? And in the previous episode, we covered quite a bit of ground. We had a 6-way dispute, but ultimately, all rivers flowed to the sea, and they didn't even have to be as disparate as it seemed. And that's going to be even accelerated and intensified, at least according to one perspective, as we move forward. So the Gemara now, towards the bottom of Daf Pei Zayin, or like in the bottom third, the Gemara says, it's 87b, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3? 4, maybe?
Or either 3 or 4. The very bottom? Or
No, not the very bottom. Here, you know what?
So 3. B3.
B3? Okay. So the Gemara says, Omar Mar Zutra stated the following. Lo Yamaron, all of this is only relevant and applicable. Lo Yamaron, Ela de lo Yamar aval anachnu chatanu. In other words, the whole dispute of which particular methodology we should choose to confess before God is only relevant or only a conversation if you didn't accept responsibility. Make the simple statement of guilt, Aval anachnu chatanu. Aval, says Mar Zutra. However, Omar, Aval anachnu chatanu. However, if you said, however or but, yes, we did sin, su loy tzarich. Nothing more is required. We don't need all those prayers. We don't need all those different ways of looking at sin and how you're going to articulate and express yourself. None of it's relevant. As long as you simply accept responsibility, accept guilt. It's a very powerful statement. First of all, what is the statement? You might notice if you look in the Gemara, Mar Zutra says, Lo yamaran ela de lo amar, aval anachnu chatanu. Aval amar, aval anachnu chatanu. The word aval shows up 3 times in the same sentence. So certainly in the beginning, Mar Zutra's words are to be understood. Lo yamaran ela. It's if you didn't say the following. However, if you said the following, then it's a different issue. But the statement is, Aval anachnu chatanu. However, we have sinned. So the question, of course, may be asked, what is the meaning of the words in the tefillah, Aval anachnu chatanu? I'm just going to see if I have any relevant questions over here. It's nice to see everybody coming back. I have no clue what Willow is talking about. He wants to know who God left alive during the Great Flood. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, and that's it. And then there's a tradition that the Og, Melech HaBashan, that Og was also, that's why it says that Ach, only, Ach Noach, that there was something else left, that Og was also over there. It's because the word Ach is 120, the gematria, and Og, Ayin Vav Gimel, also comes out to be like 120 or something. So,
But he stayed outside the boat.
yes, he was on the roof, and Noach was busy sending him food. Anyway, but this is not the subject, and I'm going to refrain from answering questions unless they are on target, meaning something that is necessary for us to understand the flow of the class. So I want to tell you something fascinating. We talked a number of times already about the sefer called Avu Darham. So Avu Darham is this 13th century work, and Spanish work, Spanish Rishon. We believe that the family name Avu Darham comes from tax collector. His grandfather was some kind of honest tax collector, like a Darham in modern day Arabic, which was the language spoken in Spain at the time, is a tax. Anyway, so he compiled this incredible compendium of rite and ritual, and what we do at what time of the year, at the special times of the year. He reviews the prayers, and he explains the meaning behind the prayers. One of the most foundational works on holidays and synagogue rite and ritual. So in Tfilas Yom HaKippurim, Avu Darham says with regard to this statement, Aval anachnu chatanu. By the way, this is how we have it in our Machzer. Sefardim, Ashkenazim, Italkiim, and everybody in between. Aval, however, anachnu chatanu. So what does that mean? However, what's the however? What does it mean, aval? So Avu Darham says like this. Yesh mefarshim. There are those who maintain that this is kimashma'o. We should understand it literally. However, we did. They're like, it wouldn't be nice if we didn't sin. However, we did. We'd love to deny this. However, we can't. I mean, you could, but it's not. I mean, it is what it is. It's not a great situation. However, as they say, it is what it is, and now you have to acknowledge it. Now, we know in the beginning of the history of humankind, humans were not very good at accepting responsibility or acknowledging guilt. Adam was a dismal failure. As soon as God confronted him, he first went into denial mode, and then after he went into denial mode, he went into blame mode, and he shifted the blame onto Chava. He said, me? Chava, talk to her. I didn't do anything wrong. She gave me the fruit. Well, that may be true. She did give him the fruit. But then again, Adam was supposed to tell her, no, that's not what God told me to do. And we can't do this. But he didn't. So he just went ahead and blamed. And then we had the first homicide, and Cain kills Abel, and God once again confronts him, and he goes into denial mode. Am I my brother's keeper? Yeah, maybe you are. Oh, if you put it that way, how do I know what happened to him? And then he says, it's such a big deal? Is my sin too big for God, the great creator of the cosmos, to bear? Is it really? Do I need to accept guilt for this? And whatever, he does kind of tshuva. Cain is the first Baal tshuva. He kind of slinks away in shame. But he doesn't just say, yes, I am guilty. The first ones who commit a terrible sin and then acknowledge their guilt are the brothers of Yosef. They are the first ones ever. And this is found in the book of Genesis, in Parshat Miketz. We're talking Genesis chapter 42, verse 41. Yitzi, it's off topic. I'm not going to respond to the questions. Not fair. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to everybody else. I'm going to stick to it. If you have an issue, I'm going to try to answer the question only if it's relevant directly to understanding what we're talking about. Nothing personal, but the show's got to go on. So what happens is that Joseph's brothers are basically under house arrest. They're arrested for 3 days. They're detained. They don't know what's going on. They came to buy food, and Yosef is creating this accusation of espionage. You're trying to undermine the security of the country. And then he says to them, all right, you know what? Since you told me a story about a younger brother, tell you what, you'll have an opportunity to demonstrate the veracity of your claims. You bring your brother here, show that you say what you mean and mean what you say, and that you're honest, and then we can move on. And then Yosef overhears them talking amongst each other. And he becomes very emotional. And what he hears the brothers accepting guilt. They don't know that this is Yosef. They don't have to accept guilt. Nobody accused them of anything. They're accepting responsibility, full responsibility. As the Torah says, Vayomru ish el achiv. One man says to his brother, Aval Hashemim anachnu. But we are guilty. But we are guilty. Alochinu asher ro'inu tzarat nafsho. We saw our brother. We saw his pain. Bihitchananu eleinu. He was pleading with us. But lo shamanu. We didn't listen to his cries. Al kain ba'a eleinu hatzara hazot. That's why we're in this pickle now. And I saw once one of the Mefarshim say that it's remarkable that a person should be in a situation where 21 years have passed, something goes wrong, and you have no doubt what you did wrong. It means you did one Aveira in 21 years. A big Aveira, mind you, a very, very big sin. But that's it. The Shvatim, the brothers of Yosef, dropped the ball once. Big time, but once. So it says there, Aval Hashemim. That's what it says. And it was the first time we have a biblical record of acceptance of guilt, and that is supposed to be our acceptance. We're supposed to do that. Aval Hashemim anachnu. We're supposed to now accept guilt. It says Aval Hashemim. It's the first confession. They're speaking up. All right, I know somebody out there is going to ask me, didn't Yehuda accept responsibility for the situation with Tamar? Yeah, kind of, eventually. When he was pushed to the wall. And somebody was going to die as a result. And he was either going to fess up or be guilty of causing murder. But here, the brothers had nothing to gain by accepting guilt. There was simply an act of tshuva which was accepted on high, as we had told. So the Avu Darham says, Yesh mefarshim, Aval Hashemim, kimashmai, Aval, but Ella, but we did sin. The Yesh mefarshim, there are those who say, no. Go back to Genesis 42. What does it mean over there, Aval Hashemim anachnu? Over there it says, Be'emet, in truth we did sin. So in other words, the word Aval Hashemim is in truth. Now here's the interesting thing. The Targum, Onkelos, renders it like this. You hear that Joseph could never forgive his brothers. That is actually factually incorrect. He forgives them very, very wholeheartedly. And not only does he forgive them, but he does incredible kindness and goodness to them. And the Zohar says that's our model of forgiveness. But again, that's not relevant to the subject. So the Targum Onkelos, who's considered to be the most authoritative translation of the Torah from the time of antiquity, from the Mishnah time, says like this. V'amru gvar la'achui. One man said to his brother, Bikushta chayoven anochna. In truth, if we want to be truthful, we are responsible. We are guilty. We created this situation. So Avu Darham says that may be the meaning of Aval Anachnu. Now is a moment of truth. Yom Kippur is a moment of truth. Let's be honest before God. It's you and God now. You got to say the truth. And the truth is we're guilty. The truth is we're responsible. The truth is we could have done better. And we will do better. Now, something very interesting that I noticed, because I looked into this a little, is that the Targum Yonatan ben Uziel, which is written prior to the Targum of Onkelos, but it is not as straightforward in a pshat manner, like Onkelos is the Rashi of antiquity. The Targum Yonatan is more of a midrashic interpretation, a lot of medrash here. I guess if you had to compare it to later commentaries, it's more like a Ramban or Rabbeinu Bachaya. It gives all kinds of other interpretations. But the Targum Yonatan does also translate the words. He also says, Bekushta chayovin anachna. Very similar. However, I noticed something very interesting. There is a third Targum. It's called Targum Yerushalmi. The Targum Yerushalmi says, Va'amron gever la'achui beram anachna, or beram anachnu chayovin. Chayovin anan, sorry. Beram chayovin anan. So, beram means however. That's what beram doesn't mean in truth. And then, I never kind of noticed this fully, but Rashi gives us both interpretations. Because each one Yes, chayav means guilty. It means obligated, guilty, but it means guilty and responsible for ultimately our situation. So Rashi says, Aval, ask any child in Israel what Aval means. He's not going to tell you the truth. What does Aval mean? However, everybody knows it means that. That's what it means. Rashi says, Kitargumo, render it like the Targum. Why? Because the Targum knew exactly what Aval means, but he said in this case, the syntax here in biblical syntax is different. It means bekushta. But Rashi's not satisfied with this. He's not satisfied with this because that's not what Aval means. All over the Bible, when the word Aval shows up, it doesn't mean in truth. What does it mean? It means however. So Rashi says, and I don't know if this is because Rashi didn't see the Targum Yerushalmi, but Rashi says, Ve'iti bebereshit Rabbah, I saw in the Medrash Rabbah, Lishna dereimahu, that this is the way they speak in the south. It's like a southern drawl. Y'all. Speak in the south. That Aval is a word really means biram. Biram means however. So it's not, in other words, that this is like a, I always read this Rashi as explaining why they said Aval with the word bekushta. But then again, why does it mean biram? So it clearly, I think I was always mistaken. And having looked now at the Targumim and seeing how the Targum Yerushalmi renders it, and then looking in the Avud Arham and seeing this, so I had like a little bit of an epiphany here. And I think that Rashi is actually giving us both possibilities. Both possibilities. So what does it mean in our davening? I don't know. It can mean both. It can mean both. It could mean, interestingly, the Avud Arham quotes the first interpretation. But we did sin. We're here at Yom Kippur, and we love God, and God loves us, and everything's great, but we did sin. But we have to deal with it. You can't sweep it under the carpet. Or, it's a moment of truth. Yes, in truth, we actually did sin. So that's the meaning of Aval. And it's very interesting to understand the concept of Aval anachnu, Aval anachnu chatanu. And if we take a look at in the right here. Fine. So that's with regard to the language. Now, the question that I think anybody might ask learning this Gemara is: we learned the Gemara 6 different opinions last time around. Is Mar Zutra arguing with the previous opinions, or is he augmenting the previous opinions? That's a real question. I think a fair question, a question that has to be asked. So the Hagoas Maimonides, which is a foundational commentary on the words of Rambam, and the Rambam, of course, restates this entire Gemara in a few pithy words. The Rambam, in the 2nd chapter of the Laws of Teshuva, after speaking about Yom Kippur being a time of Teshuva, and when we are supposed to do the Viduy, the Rambam does not include the 6-way discussion of what kind of words we should use. The Rambam goes straight to the words of Mar Zutra. And he says, Havidui shenahagu bo kol Yisrael. So what's the vidui that the Jewish people have become accustomed to using? And he doesn't talk about any of the other 6. From the timing and the amount of vidui we say, which we talked about, and we'll talk about that Bezrat Hashem in the next episode. From the timing to now, the Rambam simply says, Havidui shenahagu bo kol Yisrael is Aval anachnu chatanu. Aval anachnu chatanu. So the Hagos Maimonides says, Shma mino, from here we can derive, Iker viduhu, that is the main vidui. Udeloi ka'amaroi, says Hagos Maimonides, not like the opinions which were aired in the previous episode. The Mefarshei Vidui ben Yenacharu explain vidui in a prayerful way. No, it's not about that whole prayerful thing. Vidui is brass tacks, straight goods. Vidui. Aval anachnu chatanu, that's vidui. So, from the Hagos Maimonides, it certainly seems that we have an argument on our hands. The sages believed that you had to give some kind of frame the idea of the vidui in a particular way for it to be effective. And Mar Zutra says, just stick to the basics. Vidui, just take responsibility. Don't give me a speech. Don't give me a song and dance. Are you guilty or not? This is like straight goods. Straight goods. Ikar Viduy. Yes, I am guilty. Aval anachnu chatanu. Okay, good. Nachnu chatanu. However, the Siach Yitzchak, he has a different approach to this Gemara. He says there's no machlekes. Marzutra means to say that all of the different things that the Amoraim, that the sages were talking about in the Gemara, is the way we daven, and it's all beautiful. And of course, we daven today in a whole slew of different ways, as we'll soon hear from the Meiri. We have all kinds of minhagim, all kinds of customs that have developed, and they're very much rooted in the words of the sages. Marzuta is only noting that what the sages were talking about was the concept of how we frame and present the actual confession. But the confession itself, if you want to get to the cut and dry, you want to get to the bare bones, Aval anachnu chatanu, that's it. And therefore, the Siach Yitzchak wants to say that there is no argument whatsoever over here. The sages said what they said, and they were talking about the way we frame and introduce the Viduy, and Marzuta is talking about the Viduy itself. So there doesn't have to be a dispute, and that's the way he reads the Gemara. So I think these are two basic schools of thought of how we read the Gemara. What in fact do we do? In fact, we do all kinds of prayers. We do, as the Meiri points out, and just quote to you from the words that the Meiri uses. The Meiri says, Nohagu lahosif bo nuschaot yishanot. The custom has become to add different texts miyemei ha-Talmud from the days of the Gemara. Ukamo shehuz karakan, like is mentioned in this Gemara. Ate odera zeyolam anunogim bo. That's actually what we say, says the Meiri. We say it on Yom Kippur. Ribon ha'olamim. That we say every single day. So the confession, whether it's the Yom Kippur confession or the daily confession, it has become the custom to frame the confession in prayerful fashion, and there's no dispute then. One could argue no dispute whatsoever. Well, the Hagoras Maimonides does feel that this is disputed. At least as I understand the Hagoras Maimonides. Okay. So is this the trade goods? Is that what it is? Aval anachnu chatanu? Think back to Yom Kippur. In fact, think back to your daily Tachnun prayers. Is that what we say? Do we say Aval anachnu chatanu? What do you remember from davening? No? Aval anachnu ve'avotenu chatanu. We and our fathers have sinned. So the question is, where does that come from? The Gemara says very clearly, Aval anachnu chatanu. That's it. Straight goods. Well, if you look in the Rambam, as mentioned to you in the second chapter, the 8th halacha, he says, Havidui shenagu boi kol Yisrael is, and the Rambam writes 3 words, Aval anachnu chatanu. Exactly like the text of our Gemara in Masechet Yoma. And then the Rambam adds 3 more words. V'hu ikar havidui, and that is the bare bones. That's the primary vidui. Now, it certainly sounds from the Rambam that that's what's required. Interestingly, when we look in the Tur uses similar words. The Tur is found in Tov Reish Zayin, and we've talked a lot about the Tur many times already. I'm not going to reintroduce the Tur, but this is the forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch. Yaakov Balaturim is the one who creates the system that later the Shulchan Aruchs use. So the Tur says, he frames it different. The Rambam says, Havidu shenohagu b'Yisrael is aval anachnu chatanu v'hu ikar havidui. So first he says what we do, and he says, and that is ikar havidui. In the Tur's version, he rotates it the other way. He says, Ve'ikar havidui hu aval anachnu chatanu. And why does he do that? Because the Rambam seems to say, and that's why the Hagoras Maimonides wants to draw the conclusion from the Rambam, that the Rambam, following Marzutra, is arguing in the previous sages. That it's only this. However, the concept of not being a machlekes, like the Siach Yitzchak says, fits very nicely in the words of the Tur, because the Tur says, Ikar vidui aval anachnu chatanu. Ela shenohagu lomer gam sha'or devarim kigon ma shenomer lefanecha. And he starts speaking about the things that are quoted before, which is very similar to the Meiri. By the way, the Torah did not see the Meiri. The Meiri wasn't printed at the time, or available, as I understand. So the Meiri says this, and the Torah says this, and that seems to have been the tradition that they accepted, that as the way they understood it. However, the Lechem Mishnah says, on the words of the Rambam, he says, Venira, and it seems to me that the Rambam here is lav dafka. It's not necessarily like that. It's not only chatanu levad, ella chatanu, avinu, poshanu, because these are three different levels of sin. One is wanton rebellion, one is carelessness, and one is, I should have been more focused. One is like absolute rebellion, brazen rebellion. One is a carelessness that's entirely guilt-ridden. And one is, we could have been more careful. So these are different levels. And we have to say, Chatanu avinu pashainu. Shezehu ikar haviduy. This is ikar haviduy. So of course you say to the Lechem Mishnah, Rabbi Lechem Mishnah, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon just said otherwise. He just said, Aval anachnu v'avesenu chatanu. So interestingly, in some versions of the printed Rambam, after it says the words Aval anachnu chatanu, it says ... as if to say, etc. And the Lechem Mishnah says, why don't you go back and look at the beginning of the Rambam? And the Rambam, in the first halacha, in the second part of the very first halacha, of the first chapter of Teshuva, he said, Ketzad mitvade, and how does one perform confession? The Rambam says, you say, Ona Hashem, please God, Chatasi avisi pashaiti lefanecha. Doesn't just say Chatasi avisi pashaiti. He uses three different terminologies. He says, you see, the Rambam already said it. The Rambam doesn't have to repeat himself. The Rambam says, Aval anachnu chatanu, he means Chatanu avinu pashainu. That's what he means. And the Lechem Mishnah argues that the Rambam himself says this, and this is based on the words that we find earlier in the Gemara, that the Gemara speaks about the confession of the Kohen Gadol in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara, when it speaks about the Kohen Gadol's confession, it says clearly that he would say, Chatu, Avu, and Pashu. So there's three different languages. Incidentally, even though the Tur seems to follow the approach that there is not a machlekes here in the Gemara, more like the approach of the Siyas Yitzchak. So if the Tur also has commentary. The Tur has one of the major commentaries on the Tur is something called the Prisha. And the Prisha says, Nira li, it seems to me, Sharatza Leimar Hanusach. He's saying the text, there's a famous text. The text is Chatanu. But everybody knows that Chatanu comes along with Avinu Pashainu. Chatanu is Avinu Pashainu. Chatanu is just like, what do we call, the opening line. Everybody knows you got to say the whole line. It's like sometimes we say things in our language, in English. We say something, it's self-understood that, you have to say something, and you use the opening line, and when you say something, then you have to, that you say the rest. So somebody says, I plead the Fifth, which is an American euphemism, right? The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. They don't say, I plead the Fifth Amendment. I plead the Fifth. So if somebody would say, Fifth what? So you have to be on your toes to say the Fifth Amendment. But I plead the Fifth. Obviously, it's the Fifth Amendment. Chatanu obviously comes along with Avinu Pashainu. So the Prisha says that you should know that it says, Anachnu, Chatanu, Ashamnu, Bagadnu. It's referring to the whole expression that's used. And he says, this is also, it's not only my opinion, this is also found in the manuscripts of Rabbi Eliezer Rokeach, who were going back all the way to the 10th century, and he was a disciple of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, and he writes the same thing as well, that you have to say, Aval anachnu, Chatanu, and he's referring also to Chatanu Avinu Pashainu. And the Prisha says, I know there's another school of thought. V'loiki yeshayimrim, not like those who say, Sheretzeinu loymar, Elu Gimel Tevis Lachud, that these three words cover the base. You want to talk about baseline? That's the basics. These three words. Aval anachnu chatanu. I have sinned. Okay, that's it. I have sinned, I've been rebellious, I've been naughty, I've been careless, I've been thoughtless. You don't have to say all that. I have sinned. Just acknowledge, I have sinned. Now, where does this come from? Where do people get this idea that that's enough? So he says, Shekain David HaMelech alav hashalom, when David HaMelech acknowledged his sin, Omar, he said, Chatasi. And the moment he said, I have sinned, immediately, Hever mimeno einashmisa, the punishment of death was lifted. The moment he said, I sinned. Now, I don't know what the Prisha is referencing with certainty, but interestingly, in the Avud Darham, I found exactly this. Avud Darham says, Afal pi shenitakein viduy zeh al alpha besa, even though this goes following the alphabet. Oshamnu, bogadnu, aleph beis, gazalnu, dibarnu dofi, aleph beis gimel dal, and so on and so forth. So he says, we first say, tchila chatanu, koidim l'shar. And he says, this is because we have a Medrash Tanchuma that tells us the nation came to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is at the time when Moshe Rabbeinu struck the rock, and then people sinned, and then snakes came out. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, the people came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, Chatanu. Chatanu. We have sinned against you and God. We have sinned. V'kevan sha'amru chatanu, Avud Darham says the moment they said Chatanu, miyad nitratzu lahem, that they don't say Chatanu avinu pashaynu. They said Chatanu. That's it. And then he says, V'omer b'makom acher, it is also referenced elsewhere, Shekol mi shechata, anybody who sins, V'omer chatasi, and he says, I sinned, I take responsibility, ein reshut lamalach ligabo, the angel of death can no longer touch him. So, he doesn't talk about David HaMelech clearly, but it sounds like, from what the Avud Darham is saying, that he follows the school of thought that the words are Aval anachnu chatanu. That is the bare basics. Yes, we add all kinds of things, but really, mi'ikar hadin, if you want to get very technical, the Gemara says Aval anachnu chatanu. That is the text of our Gemara, and that is the way it reads. That's the proper way to read it. This is what we see in Avud Darham. Very interestingly, if we take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, so, what does the Shulchan Aruch say? So, this is quite fascinating. The Mechaber, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, says nothing. He doesn't mention it. I guess because, my guess is because it's not really relevant to you. You're going to read what the Siddur says anyway. I don't know. What's even more interesting to me was that in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, this entire idea is not discussed. Not discussed at all. He talks about the concept of when you say Viduy, and then he goes into the next piece of Gemara, which is if you recite it together with the Chazan. He omits this in Siman Tafresh Zayin entirely. But in the regular Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, is silent. However, the Ramah does make a note. And he says, Ikar haviduy hu aval anachnu chatanu. The main viduy is aval anachnu chatanu. He says, Mechoimer lekal, from light to yes. Okay, is the halacha like the Rambam? That's Ikar Aviduy. It's practically speaking, it's not relevant because we say in the Siddur, which my guess why the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention it. But that's what the Ramah says. So the Magen Avram says Pirush Kan. Over here, what he means to say is Kan Maschel HaViduy. That's how Viduy begins. Viduy begins with Aval Anachnu Chatanu, but it doesn't stop with Aval Anachnu Chatanu, and that's Ad Achar Hashamnu. And he's citing here the words of the Shalah. And he says Upashta de Talmuda Mashma de Ein Sarach Yoter. However, the Magen Avram says, I have to admit, when you look at the Gemara seems to say, Mazruter said, Aval Anachnu Chatanu. He didn't add any more words. The Ein Sarach Lefarat Achet. You don't have to say more. Va'achar kavanas halev hin advarim. It's about what you're thinking. So you know what you sinned. You don't have to say in three different ways. You know if you sinned big or sinned small, or was careless or thoughtless or rebellious. You know. You know. Okay, so you know. Then you'll think what you wish when you use those words. People use words like I love you 1,000,000 times a day. It's probably a word that gets used millions of times a day. And people have, they mean all the kind of different things. There's a terrible joke to say a fellow was sitting in the backyard on a summer afternoon, and he was holding a glass of wine, and he said, "Oh, I love you, I love you." And his wife said to him, "Is that you speaking, or is that the wine speaking?" He said, "It's me speaking to my wine." So people love everything from candy to fruit to their dog, to the new clothing they bought, to the deal they got, to their children, to their spouse. I mean, they use love all the time, you know. I love this coffee. Obviously, there are various forms of love. Even interpersonal love have many different forms of love. So a person says a word, chatanu, I sinned. What does sin mean? You know what it means. You know who you are. You know your relationship with God. So that's it. It's very interesting that the Magen Avraham seems to say that that's sufficient. That's sufficient. He says the Ramah says, "Ikar avides aval anachnu chatanu," and I actually find quite fascinating that the Rambam says, the Gemara says aval anachnu chatanu. The Rambam says aval anachnu chatanu. The Tur says aval anachnu chatanu. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't even mention it. The Ramah says aval anachnu chatanu. And in each example, we have a commentary who says, I know he said aval anachnu chatanu, but really he means the entire sentence. It just begins with that. In the Rambam we have the Lechem Mishnah, and in the Tur we have the Prisha, and in the Shulchan Aruch we have the Magen Avraham. But the Magen Avraham acknowledges, Pashta the Talmud, if you just read the Gemara straightforward, it sounds like aval anachnu chatanu is sufficient. That's certainly what it sounds like. Yitzi was saying he meant to say that from the Lechem Mishnah, it's a stira from this Rambam to what the Rambam writes in the beginning. Well, that's exactly why the Lechem Mishnah says that's what the Rambam meant, because otherwise it would sound like a contradiction. Because the Rambam says one thing in the beginning of the first chapter, and then he says something else in chapter 2. So the Lechem Mishnah says that's what he meant. He doesn't have to repeat himself. He's just starting in the beginning. Listen, some of the greatest sages believed with every fiber of their being that was the intention of the Torah, that was the intention of the Rambam, that was the intention of that's the intention of the Ramah. You can't dismiss this. It's not simple. Like I said, on a practical level, it's not. I don't think it makes a difference in the end. You're going to go to shul and you're going to say the words. If you could say aval anachnu chatanu, you could say Hashamnu begadnu gazalnu dubarnu defi also. It's almost impossible to imagine a person's going to come to shul and he's only going to say one word and that's it. I'm not saying anything else now. You're in shul, you're going to read. Everybody has a machzor today. You read what says in the machzor. Maybe in antiquity, when people didn't have, or in the Middle Ages, people didn't have a printed siddur, and people were praying by heart or just listening to the chazan, maybe they wouldn't mouth those words. Maybe that was more of an issue in those days. Maybe. I'm just suggesting. I don't know. At any rate, we can see here that there is a big discussion of whether we say aval anachnu v'aveiseinu chatanu. Now, why would we even say aval anachnu v'aveiseinu chatanu? About Hashamnu begadnu. Now, another detail in the Gemara. The Gemara says, aval anachnu chatanu. The Gemara does not say, aval anachnu va'aveiseinu chatanu. And the question is, where does this aval anachnu va'aveiseinu come from? So, the oldest source that I found is the Sif in the Alter Rebbe part of the conversation. The Alter Rebbe does not mention it. He omits this entirely. This portion is not talked about in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. So the Rabbeinu Yoma, who lived just after the Rambam, in fact, he was a chief detractor of the Rambam, who later felt terrible about the way that he demonized the Rambam. And because of this, he wants to know about the entire Selichot prayer. So Selichot are not confession. Selichot are not. This is about Yom Kippur. This is about, and so I would say to you that the main thing of the confession is the Hashamnu Bagadnu and the paragraph that follows it. But the Selichot is this. We're not talking Selichot now. Now we're talking confession, and specifically confession in Yom Kippur. Anyway, Rabbeinu Yoma decided to write a special treatise on the mitzvah of Teshuva to make up for his grave mistake in condemning the Rambam. And he called it Sha'arei Tshuva, the gates of Tshuva. So in Sha'arei Tshuva, There are a number of different gates. The first gate, he has principles. So Ikar Ha'aba Asar, the 14th principle in Sha'ar Teshuva, reads like this. Haviduy shenemar, the viduy that is stated. And here he quotes Leviticus 5, verse 5. We talked about this. If it's unfamiliar, in the first episode, we referenced this verse a number of times. The verse is talking about a korban, about an offering, and it says, V'hisvada asher chota oleha. And you will confess that which you sinned upon her, meaning upon the animal. So the Sha'ar Teshuva says, V'yesh olav lahazkir avonotav ve'avonot avotav. He should mention, when one confesses, one should mention their sins and the sins of the previous generations. Why? Ki hoya ne'nash aleihem, because he might be punished for them, be'echzo ma'aseh avotav bi'ado, when he grasps or continues to hold on to the same bad behavior. So therefore you have to do tshuva from that behavior. You have to absolve yourself of that behavior. You have to cleanse yourself of that behavior. And you do so by virtue of expressing profound regret and a new resolve for the future. And he says, if you look later on in the book of Leviticus, you go forward to chapter 26, which is Parshas Bechukotai, and it's talking about the tochacha, about the terrible curses of terrible things that will happen to Klal Yisrael if we don't listen to Hashem, that it says, V'hitvadu et avonam ve'et avon avotam. It says they will confess their sins and the sins of their fathers. So Leviticus, in the beginning, is where we find the concept of confession, but at the end of Leviticus, when it speaks about people confessing, not in the perimeter of the Beit HaMikdash, not in the syntax of a korban, but just confessing, tshuva. It says their sins and the sins of their ancestors. Now, what this seems to say, if you just understand the Sha'ar Teshuva in a straightforward way, if you sin and you don't do tshuva, so what's going to happen? There's going to be a consequence. You know, this notion that's bandied around today, that God is all loving and everything is good and it doesn't really matter. Do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. It's just not true. So it's basically heresy. It simply contradicts open statements in the Torah. The Torah says there are consequences. So if you don't do tshuva, there's going to be consequences. We may not know what the consequences are. We may not understand how the consequences work, but there will be consequences. It's invariable. That's what we believe in schar va'onesh. If you go away from the idea of schar va'onesh, of consequence, which includes reward and punishment, you leave the building as far as Torah Judaism is concerned. One of the 13 principles of faith. Now, what Rabbeinu Yehuda seems to be saying is, if you don't do tshuva, you're not only going to be punished for your sins, you're going to be punished for your parents' sins also. However, if you do teshuva, you won't be punished. And therefore, when you're doing tshuva, you must mention the sins of your fathers too, because you have to do tshuva for that also. You're going to be punished for that. Now, of course, on the surface, this does not make any sense. Why would I be punished for the sins of my parents? They can deal with their sins, and I'll deal with my sins. Why should somebody else get punished for your sins? It actually makes no sense. If there's consequences and responsibility, I have to bear the responsibility or the consequences of my actions, not somebody else's actions. So the truth is, it's a very complicated thing. The Gemara talks about this. And it's a Gemara which is found in Masechet Brachot. The Gemara in Masechet Brachot is found on Daf Zayin, I think, Zayin Amud Beis. And there is a Gemara, the primary Gemara, Rabbeinu Nisim Gaon himself notes in the Gemara and Brachos that if you want to get the subject more fully, you should go to Masechet Sanhedrin on page 27. That's where the subject is dealt with. So in the third chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin, we're talking about the idea of testimony. And if there's testimony, then there can be a conviction. And if there's a conviction, then there can be a sentence. And if there's a sentence, then there can be a punishment that's carried out. including capital punishment in the most heinous of examples. So the Gemara says that we cannot accept the testimony of relatives because it says "Lo yumsu avos al banim." You can't kill the parents by virtue of the children, which means if the children are going to give testimony, we can't take that testimony seriously. Even if they say that was horrible testimony, the person gets up and he says, yes, I'm sorry, it's true. My father is a murderer. And another guy gets up and he says, it's true. He's a murderer. Like, what are you going to do? It's true. It's true. And maybe these two fellows are brothers from a different mother. I don't know. Same father. It's true, he says. It's true. It's true. We don't have a conviction. Why? Because the Yom Kippur Salbanim. So the Gemara says you can't put the fathers to death by virtue of the testimony of the children, of the progeny. So the Gemara says, Ma Talmud Leimer. What is this trying to teach us? Im lelamed shelo yumsu aves ba'avoin banim. If we're trying to say that you cannot punish parents for the sins of children, ubanim ba'avoin avos, and you can't punish children for the sins of their parents. It says ish becheto yumas. A person should be convicted, tried, convicted, and punished for your sins. Judaism does not believe that we should carry out collective punishment against the progeny of somebody who was a mass murderer. So if you have a Nazi, a mass murderer, a monster, and you find his children, the Nazi is dead, thank God. But now his children, and the children are unrepentant. They believe their father was a hero. They sing his praises. They revere his memory. Can you convict them for the father's crimes? If Mengele had children, I don't know if he did. I don't think anybody knows the truth. And if it's true that they finally found his body and he managed to evade the capture, if it's true. And if he had children, and we would find those children now, would we have the legal right to put the children to death for the horrific sins of their father? The halachic answer is no. Not much as you might want to and feel like it, the halachic answer is no. If you find Mengele, you kill him in the fastest way you can, but I guess you have to go through due process. So what is the meaning then of la yum soavis albanim? So the Gemara says it must mean by virtue of testimony, because it cannot mean literally that you're not going to punish somebody for somebody else's sin. That's self-understood. So the Gemara's son comes along and says, Ubanim ba'avin aves lai. Are you telling me that you cannot punish the children for the sins of the father? What about the words that God said to Moshe, Poked avon avot al banim al shileshim val rebeim? That the sins of the father, they'll be punished for the next generation and then the generation after that and a fourth generation. So they are going to get punished. So the Gemara says, that's only in a case kisha ochzim ma'aseh avoteim biyadeim. That's if they do the same thing. So in other words, if you find a neo-Nazi, and the neo-Nazi, his father and his mother were camp commandants. They killed Jews, no question about it. And now they joined some radical Islamist group, and they're still killing Jews. Like we know in the Entebbe hostage takers, there was a German woman, a Nazi amongst them, a daughter of Nazis, an avowed supremacist. She was there together with the Islamic fascists, together with them, ready to kill Jews. So when you kill the child, that child who does exactly the same thing, you're not only putting them to death for their sins, but also for the sins of previous generations. That's what the Gemara says. But of course, like even that's hard to understand. Why should somebody be punished for a sin they didn't do, even if they're doing the same old sin? Like what's the logic behind this? Yes, he wants to know, is that God's business how to compare Bezdin Shel Mata and Bezdin Shel Maila? No, it's not inherently different. Like, God does whatever God does. God doesn't need witnesses. But the principle remains, though, that a person is guilty and responsible for whatever they did. So I saw a very beautiful explanation, which really resonated with me today, and I want to share it. There's a Meforesh, a commentary on the Tanakh, who is known as Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, or Ralbag. He's also known as Gersonides, son of Gershon, like Maimonides, son of Maimon, Nachmanides, son of Nachman, Gersonides, son of Gershon. So Ralbag, or Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, in his commentary on the 7th chapter of the book of Joshua, says something quite remarkable. And this is... I'm filling in to give it a fuller sense. Essentially, he speaks about the punishments not as chas v'shalom vindictive, not as God getting vengeance. He speaks about the concept of punishment as the idea of cleansing. Why does, and the Rambam says this very clear, that even the punishments of Torah are not, it's not evil chas v'shalom. Everything in Torah is good. It's Hashem's love and Hashem's concern, and as people, humanity should be saved. So the question then becomes, why would a person who is continuing to sin, like the previous generations, require a greater punishment, as in a greater cleansing? And this is what Ralbag says. He says, when a person does a sin, so the sin is an evil embedded into his soul. And then when there's a consequence, and he suffers, so that softens the person. It cleanses the person. It allows the human being to be humbled and to be contrite and to release or expunge his soul from these toxins, from this evil behavior. And you could see it. Unfortunately, sometimes people suffer terribly. People go through horrible experiences, and they emerge a different person. They emerge more sensitive. They emerge more humble. They emerge more caring, more considerate. They felt the pain. They learn how to feel the pain of another. So Ralbag says, when a person is raised in a certain way, the evil becomes so pervasive, so profound, it saturates the core of his being to such a degree that there's a much greater punishment needed to cleanse him of those toxins, because it becomes a part of who you are, because it's generational. This fits beautifully with like the latest research of the last 30 or 40 years of genetics. Literally, the cutting edge research is all about epigenetics. Epigenetics means, like epidermis, like on the surface, that behavior that is engaged in can actually become a part of your DNA, and you pass it on to the next generation. And it's clinically proven that where there is abuse of a variety of substances with abusive and addictive behavior, that the children are much more prone to follow such behavior. That doesn't mean they're forced to. Of course, as the Rambam explains in the 8th chapter of Shmona Prokim, that the person has freedom of choice, and every person who has a predisposition or predereliction also has the inner strength to overcome that. But the predereliction is there. It's a fact. Why? Because not only because of nurture, but even because of nature. That's the big novelty, the big chiddush that they discovered, that it's even in the DNA. It's a genetic weakness, a genetic predisposition. So what happens is that when a person behaves in a very sinful fashion, sin becomes a part of their very being. And when sin is not an acquired behavior, it's not just the result of nurture or bad choices, but it becomes a part of nature, then it's very pervasive. And if it's very pervasive, a greater onesh, a greater punishment is needed to be able to humble or cleanse or change the person. And as such, the same would apply to teshuva. Teshuva would need a greater teshuva. This is very interesting. And to me, I found it resonated. It makes a lot of sense. And that's why Rabbeinu Yonah says that when a person does teshuva, he has to be sure to say, Aval anachnu ve'aveseinu chatanu. It is both us and the sins, meaning the sins that we have become accustomed to. And maybe on a very simple level, you could say, if you were brought up in a certain fashion, and this was normal to you, you don't even think it's sinful. That's what I mean. That's what my family does. That's what we do. I don't have to atone for that. Yeah, you do have to atone for that. If it's objectively bad, if Torah says it's wrong, it doesn't matter if you're raised that way. It doesn't matter if that's the way my grandparents did it, or my parents did it. So Chatanu Avesenu is for kapara, not tshuva. Not necessarily. No. It could be even for tshuva. That's the kind of, in order for the tshuva to work, that's what you have to do. And that's really what Rabbeinu Yonah says, because when he's talking about the confession, he says because there's a punishment for it, so the way to avoid that punishment is tshuva. So in the same way that the punishment would have to be more pervasive, the same way the tshuva has to be more pervasive. So this is what the Shari Tshuva says. And very interestingly, the Shnei Luchas Habris, the Shalah, in Masechet Yoma, he says that actually once in Masechet Yoma, once in Masechet TALMUD. He says something very interesting. He says that Rabbeinu Yonah writes that you have to do tshuva, and he cites the Rabbeinu Yonah that I just cited. And then he says, Al kein yosher be'enai, therefore I believe it's appropriate to me. Now, the Shalah, of course, came from Germany. He's a German Jew, German rabbi, Ashkenaz rabbi. He says we should follow the Nusach Viduy HaSfardim. We should follow the Sefardic version. Because the Sephardic version, they say, Aval anachnu v'aveseinu ashamnu bagadnu. And incidentally, this is widespread today. But it apparently was once only the custom in Spain, or the Jews of Sfarad, which later became adopted by the Ashkenazim as well. And in Masechet TALMUD, the Shalah also says, in Masechet TALMUD in the Ner Mitzvah, he says that To'im ha'olam, the world makes a mistake, and they think she'ratzu boi shalosh teves ve'enikrein. He said, really, kol ha'nusach shaloshamnu. It's not enough to say chatanu avinu pashanu or aval anachnu chatanu. He said, no, it's not aval anachnu chatanu. Aval anachnu chatanu is just the beginning. Okay, this is very similar to the other commentaries we had on the Shulchan Aruch about, and this is what incidentally, these are the very words that the Magen Avraham is quoting. But then he goes on to say, Aval anachnu anachatanu, and he says, V'chein timsa b'defus sidurei hasfardim. He says, Aval kosov b'ksiva gasa, there's in bold print, and then there's in smaller print till the end of the Viduy. So he says, the Aval anachnu v'avesenu chatanu, and that's the bold print, and then it continues off with the rest of the Viduy. So anyway, it's pretty clear that we need not only to recite the concept of our sin, confess for our sins, but in fact, the way to do this is for us to specifically spell out also the sins of our parents when we do this. And now, of course, we learned the Gemara. It's very nice. The Gemara told us about what this is, and we have a whole bunch of different ways of understanding the words of the Gemara. Is this in fact proven? Is it in fact proven? So the next piece of Gemara, the next short piece of Gemara, tells us about a teaching of Bar Hamdudi, or in other places it says Bar Hamduri. Bar Hamduri was a second or third generation Babylonian Amora. He was a disciple of the great Shmuel. And if you remember in the previous episode, we talked about Rav and Shmuel. He was a disciple of Shmuel, and historians believe that he was the teacher of Rava, the famous Rava. And his name was Avdimi. We have one place where it says Avdimi Bar Hamduri or Hamdudi in Masechet Sukkah. So anyway, so Bar Hamdudi says, and it makes sense because he was a disciple of Shmuel, Hava Kamina Kami de Shmuel, I was sitting with Shmuel, and Vahava Yosef, and he was sitting. V'chimoto Shalicha de Tzibura, when the Chazan got up to the words, Va'omar aval anachnu chatanu. All of a sudden, he rose. And we see here that the confession requires a standing posture. And we see here that this is the confession. Because all the other prayers that we talked about before, Shmuel himself was the one who introduced the other prayer. Shmuel himself was the one he's one of the 6 opinions before. Yet he didn't rise during those prayers. When did he rise? He rose by Aval anachnu chatanu. So Bar Hamduri says, Shema Mino, we can understand from this that Iker Viduy Havehu, that is the primary Viduy. And the emes is that from this perspective, it seems likely that they aren't arguing. That Shmuel did say whatever he said, the prayers that he said. The prayers are all, the prayers are said. However, the Iker, the primary, is Aval anachnu chatanu. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. And Be'ezus Hashem, in the next episode, we're going to conclude this piece of Gemara because we have a lot of questions that we have to answer. First of all, what is this business with the Shliach Tzibur? How did the Chazan get involved in this? What about Shmuel himself? What did he do himself? Why is he even doing confession? What is he's standing when the Chazan speaks? That's question 1. And question 2, why is he standing? Why do you have to stand? And then a bigger question is did he only stand for Aval anachnu chatanu? So we're going to, Bezrat Hashem, we'll finish off the next how, the final how, the part 3 how. We'll finish off this Gemara Be'ezus Hashem in the next episode, which will conclude this little section of this series of the confession. Thank you very much for joining. I hope that we all do tshuva long before Yom Kippur. You say, beat the rush, do tshuva now. And we know the Friedrich Rebbe told us, la'alter l'tshuva, la'alter l'gula. We just have to do tshuva. And once we do that, then we'll merit the redemption and the coming of Mashiach. So may that be b'mheira, will be amenu speedily and in our days. Thank you very much for joining. Please share, please like. Hopefully, the more we learn about tshuva and the importance of tshuva and how to do tshuva, the better we'll do what we're supposed to do. And the faster, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring the curtain down on Galut and usher us into the blessed era of Mashiach. Hopefully, long before this year's Yom Kippur, we will be in the third Beis Hamikdash, b'mheira, will be amenu, amen. Thanks for joining.
I hope my questions